"You're a good man, Walter, but this company needs to evolve. You're just not part of the future anymore." That was the last thing the new CEO said to me, reclining in the very chair I had occupied for nearly 2 decades, one hand resting casually on the desk where I had balanced hundreds of financial reports. I don't recall how I responded if I said anything at all, because all I could hear was the wind brushing against the 17th floor windows, whispering over the slow-moving Mississippi below. I used to imagine that if I ever left this office, it would be with my head held high, after a standing ovation, maybe even a farewell toast not like this, replaced and erased in silence. My name is Walter Granger. I'm 63 years old. Until this morning, I was the chief financial officer at Crestmore Industries, a manufacturing firm based in St. Louis. I had been there for 17 years, long enough to survive the 2009 crash, guide the company through 3 mergers, and preserve thousands of jobs. I gave this place everything so much that when I was diagnosed with early-stage pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, I only stepped away for treatment, not retirement. I came back weaker in body, maybe, but sharper than ever behind the numbers. I never gave TED Talks, never chased headlines. I didn't sell visionized, safeguarded value. Every quarter closed clean, every audit passed. I believed in honest books, even when no one else seemed to care anymore. But then, Gavin Mays came along, 37. Fresh from a buzzword-laden tech startup I had to Google to believe. In less than 3 months, he'd swept through Crestmore like a storm-changing staff, dismantling systems, rewriting a culture we had spent years building. I knew my days were numbered the moment he invited me to that unannounced one-on-one meeting. No agenda, no pleasantries, just his polished shoes propped on my desk and a verdict hidden behind a polite smile. I've lived long enough to know when people want you gone, they don't yell. They just call you old school. What he didn't know was that I had already started paying attention long before he thought to push me out. I wasn't always a numbers man. I grew up stacking lumber in my grandfather's tool shed behind our old family home in Jefferson, Missouri, just off the 2-lane road where trucks rolled in from the mill every dawn. My father used to say that integrity wasn't something you wore on your sleeve, it was the way you tightened every bolt and counted every nail, even when no one was watching. That stuck with me. By the time I finished college working nights at a gas station to pay my way, I had turned down higher offers from bigger firms in Chicago and Dallas, choosing instead to stay closer to home and help rebuild Crestmore Industries, a struggling local manufacturer that had barely survived the early 2000s downturn. It wasn't glamorous, and there were no executive perks waiting for me. But I saw something in Crestmore worth saving. I saw good people millwrights and machinists with calloused hands and worn boots fighting every day just to hold on to their jobs and feed their families. Over the years, I climbed the ranks not because I networked at charity galas or golfed with board members, but because I got the job done quietly, steadily, without fanfare. During the recession of 2009, when suppliers pulled credit lines and half the companies in our sector folded, I stayed up for nights on end, rewriting budgets, negotiating with lenders, and finding ways to keep the lights on without slashing our workforce to pieces. And when the CEO at the time, Gerald Monroe, called me into his office and handed me the CFO title, he said one thing I never forgot. "I sleep better when I know you're watching the books, Walter." That responsibility meant something to me. So when 3 years ago, I sat in a sterile hospital room with my hands trembling, and the doctor used words like pancreatic lesion and immediate biopsy, the first thing I worried about wasn't dying, it was leaving things unfinished. The diagnosis was early-stage cancer, aggressive but caught in time. I took 6 months away from Crestmore, not just for the treatments, which were brutal, but to try and imagine a life where I wasn't useful anymore. I lost weight, my hair, and for a while, the will to look ahead. But what pulled me back wasn't the promise of healing, it was the work waiting for me. When I returned, I didn't ask for sympathy. I just showed up, a little slower maybe, but more grounded. I brought with me the leather portfolio my wife Evelyn had given me on my 60th birthday, back when she still believed we'd grow old together. She passed from breast cancer a year before my diagnosis, and in a way, I felt like we had both crossed the fire, her in silence, me through survival. From that point forward, every report I filed, every anomaly I flagged, and every dollar I accounted for carried her memory. The world around me, however, had begun to shift. The company that once prided itself on grit and loyalty was growing faster than I could recognize. New board members talked less about craftsmanship and more about agile expansion. Words like synergy, disruption, and digital transformation started replacing solid metrics and manufacturing margins. At first, I tried to adapt. I mentored younger analysts, pushed for cleaner automation, even sat through webinars on blockchain asset tracking. But beneath the surface, something colder was seeping in. People no longer asked, "Is it right?" Only, "Can we spin it?" Still, I held the line. By the time Gavin Mays arrived, sleek and overconfident in his venture capital vocabulary, the seeds of change had already been sown. But I had seen storms before. I believed if I kept my head down and did what I had always done, serve the company with honesty and backbone and truth, would outlast fashion. I was wrong. The day he called me outdated, I realized this wasn't just about business. It was about erasure. They weren't just replacing my role, they were rewriting the narrative, scrubbing away the hands that had built the foundation. They were now paving over with buzzwords and branding. But what they failed to understand, what Gavin would never learn in any MBA program, was that some of us don't bend because we can't. We don't bend because we've already broken, healed, and chosen to stand straight. I had faced cancer. I had buried my wife. I had walked through fire twice and still showed up every Monday at 6:45 a.m., coffee in hand, to protect the integrity of a company that no longer had the courage to say my name out loud. And just as I had done all those years ago during the recession, I began preparing quietly this time, not to save the company, but to expose what it had become. At first, I told myself that Gavin's arrival was just another leadership shuffle, the kind that happens when a company grows too fast and the board starts craving sparkle instead of substance. He came in like a man rehearsing for a keynote, all buzzwords and polished charm, shaking hands he never intended to hold on to and making promises no one asked for. His first move wasn't to understand the soul of Crestmore, but to overhaul a tearing down systems that had carried us through 2 economic storms and replacing them with trend-driven structures that looked impressive in pitch decks, but made little sense to those of us who understood how the machine actually ran. It didn't take long to see where this was headed. 2 weeks into his tenure, Gavin pushed through a high-priced consulting contract with a firm called Mirror Edge Strategies, claiming they would lead our brand revitalization initiative. What struck me wasn't the idea every new CEO wants to leave a mark, but the speed and opacity. Procurement protocols were bypassed. No competitive bids were solicited. And when I asked to review the deliverables or benchmark data, I was told, curtly, that we need to move faster than legacy procedures allow. Then came the restructuring. It started subtly, with a new chief innovation officer inserted between the finance team and the executive board, an unfamiliar face named Kellen Price, fresh from a startup with more seed funding than track record. Suddenly, reports that used to land on my desk were funneled through Kellen's office first, for contextual enhancement, as they called it. When I raised concerns about data integrity and compliance, Gavin smiled and told me that context is more important than control. I wanted to believe this was just naivete wrapped in ambition, but then something happened that snapped that illusion. I overheard Gavin during a closed-door meeting I wasn't supposed to be near, telling someone on a speaker call, "The financials are stuck in old-school logic. We'll need to get creative if we want to show movement." Those weren't the words of a man adjusting strategy. They were the words of someone preparing to manipulate the frame of truth itself. So I began watching closely, quietly, without making waves. It started with small discrepancies, vendor invoices that lacked detail, project costs that appeared inflated, signatures missing from approvals that used to be mandatory. One night, as I was cross-referencing quarterly budget lines, Trent Mullins, a soft-spoken but sharp internal auditor who had been on my team for nearly a decade, stopped by my office with a manila folder in hand and hesitation in his eyes. "There's something off with the tech investment entries," he said, barely above a whisper. "The numbers don't line up between the original entry logs and what's being sent in reports." I didn't ask how he'd noticed. I already knew. Trent had that same discomfort I was starting to feel in my bones, that something wasn't just changing, it was rotting. I told him to document everything, to stick strictly to facts, no opinions, no assumptions. He nodded once and left the folder on my desk before walking out like a man who just broken rank. My late wife, Evelyn, would have urged me to confront the board, to call it out in a full meeting, to go down swinging. But since her passing, I changed. Not softened, but recalibrated. I didn't need a stage, I needed proof. Solid, undeniable, unforgiving proof. So instead of ringing alarms, I began a quiet audit of my own. I accessed archived payment systems, downloaded transaction logs, and rebuilt expense trails piece by piece. I noticed a pattern. Inflated vendor contracts, consulting firms with no physical address, expense reclassifications, without supporting documentation. One name kept appearing: Vertex Analytics, a supposed data consultancy charging us premium rates for transformation mapping. But there were no reports, no deliverables, just invoices and bank routing numbers. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. These weren't careless oversights or isolated errors. They were part of a deliberate network of financial misdirection, and the timing lined up perfectly with Gavin's arrival. Worse still, when I traced the shell companies tied to these transactions, some of them had incorporation dates eerily close to the day the board announced his appointment. They hadn't removed me because I was too old school. They removed me because I was in the way. I sat alone in my office that evening, looking at the laminated plaque Evelyn had given me years ago. Do the right thing, even when no one's watching. I realized then that doing the right thing wouldn't be enough. I had to make sure the right people saw it, heard it, and couldn't look away. I didn't start out with a plan, at least not the kind you draw on a whiteboard or draft into a memo. What I had was instinct sharpened by years of tracing numbers. No one else bothered to look attend a feeling I couldn't shake, the kind that wakes you up at 3 in the morning and won't let you go back to sleep. Something wasn't just off at Crestmore. Something was being hidden, buried beneath layers of flashy jargon and redacted summaries. So I did what I've always done when the wind shifts in the wrong direction. I kept my mouth shut and opened the books. I didn't confront anyone or raise alarms. I knew how that story ended. Old man clings to power, bitter about change, branded a liability before being quietly erased. No, I needed to work under the radar, where no one would suspect the man they thought had already given up was still paying close attention. While Gavin paraded his transformation agenda across executive meetings and introduced more outside specialists, I began building a private archive. I started simple, exporting monthly ledgers, capturing invoice trails, and downloading departmental budget revisions. It was tedious work, especially late into the night when the office was quiet and the glow from my monitor was the only light left on that floor. But there was a strange comfort in Ite's sense that, in this small act of discipline, I was reclaiming something they thought they'd taken from me. What I found, at first, felt inconclusive minor anomalies in vendor billing, vague descriptors like strategic consultation or emerging solutions. But when I traced the wire transfers to recipient accounts, many of them led to firms with no physical addresses, no verifiable personnel, and in some cases, no websites. One such name, Westvale Group, received nearly $500,000 over 4 months for growth analysis. Yet, I couldn't find a single report, slide deck, or email chain to justify it. Their incorporation documents listed a P.O. box in Delaware and a registered agent who had ties to 3 other shell companies that had also begun invoicing Usadli, all after Gavin's second month in office. I didn't jump to conclusions. I cross-checked timelines, matching vendor activity with leadership changes, policy shifts, and budget reallocations. The patterns were clear. Every significant transaction coincided with a decision made not by a department head, but by Gavin or his new CFO in waiting, Zachary Colia, 29-year-old financial innovator who had just completed a well-publicized Tech Summit appearance and was now quietly assuming control over core systems without anyone noticing the trail he was leaving behind. I had learned, over a lifetime in finance, that corruption doesn't usually shout it, whispers through spreadsheets, tucks itself behind consulting line items, and disguises itself with inflated terminology that few dare to question. And most of all, it relies on speed and distraction, moving too fast for anyone who still believes in doing things by the book to catch up. But I wasn't trying to catch up. I was watching and documenting. I created a secure mirror of the financial system, one that only I could access, something I had originally designed years earlier for continuity during disasters, but which now served a different purpose entirely. Every suspicious transaction I uncovered, I copied. Every budget anomaly I flagged, I backed up. I organized the data chronologically, linking vendor records to internal approvals, noting whenever Gavin's name or Zachary's authorization codes appeared. I cross-referenced personnel changes, flagged project codes that seemed to exist only on paper, and kept receipts, thousands of them stored on encrypted drives with rotating passwords and a trail only I could follow. I didn't work alone, though no one working with me fully realized what I was doing. Trent, the auditor who had first raised concerns, continued forwarding discrepancies under the guise of routine review. A few junior analysts shared documents when I casually asked about older reporting frameworks. And then there was Nina Carr, a longtime manager in accounts payable, who mentioned almost in passing that certain new vendors had stopped submitting their standard quarterly reports, even though they were billing more frequently than ever. Each thread I pulled led to another, until the weave began to unravel. But I knew information alone wasn't enough. I needed it protected untouchable, even if I was pushed out tomorrow. So I uploaded everything in stages to multiple secure locations, each one masked with innocuous file names and offsite backups. And because paranoia, I've learned, is just realism with better data, I set up a dead man switch. If I failed to check in with the system every 48 hours, an automated release would trigger, sending full documentation to 3 federal agencies and 2 independent financial journalists I had respected for years. There was no drama in any of this, no cloak and dagger thrill, just numbers. Cold, quiet, undeniable numbers. And if I had done my job right, as I always had, those numbers would speak for themselves when the time came. Because when your voice is ignored and your presence dismissed, you don't argue. You show them what the truth looks like, printed in black and white, signed and time-stamped, and impossible to bury. I had the data, I had the proof. What I didn't have yet was a way to make it matter. Because the truth, as I'd come to learn through years in boardrooms and budget reviews, doesn't shout its own name. It needs the right ears to hear it, the right eyes to see past distractions, and the right moment to strike before it's buried under spin and silence. And in the world, Crestmore had become a place where image outpaced substance and loyalty meant little unless it came with a press release I couldn't afford to misstep. So I moved quietly, not out of fear, but precision. My first instinct was to reach out to Martin Delaney, the chairman of the board, who had once championed my promotion and stood beside me during the 2009 restructuring. But when I called his assistant, I was told Martin was on extended leave and his interim replacement was Chase Monroe, a younger executive with direct ties to Gavin's previous company, a name I had seen, not coincidentally, on one of the shell vendor registration forms I'd flagged. That alone told me the rot ran deeper than I'd hoped. I needed someone untouched, someone who hadn't been lured in by Gavin's talk of innovation or blinded by Zachary's credentials. After a long night scanning board member bios and reviewing past votes on fiscal policy, I found 3 names who, while quiet, had always leaned toward conservatism, transparency, and internal accountability. Elaine Maddox, a retired operations executive, David Kwan, representing the Employee Pension Trust, and Anthony Rivas, the board's oldest member, who had never missed a vote in 27 years but rarely spoke a word unless he truly meant it. I drafted emails to each of them, not accusatory, not speculative, just carefully worded expressions of concern, each accompanied by a set of preliminary records, transaction dates, invoice copies, internal policy discrepancies, enough to raise eyebrows but not trigger legal defenses. I scheduled the messages to send 2 days later, giving myself time to secure another layer of protection, physical evidence backup stored in a weatherproof lockbox, and a notarized affidavit detailing my investigation, sealed with my lawyer and scheduled for release if anything ever happened to me. Meanwhile, I reached out to Nina, the quiet but sharp-eyed manager from accounts payable who had flagged Westville Group weeks earlier. We met in a small cafe off Grant Avenue, one I used to visit with Evelyn after hospital checkups. The smell of cinnamon rolls and old coffee was oddly comforting, even as I slid an envelope across the table and asked her a question that changed everything. "Nina," I said gently, "do you remember that audit protocol we set up after the Porter acquisition? The one with the mirrored verification trail for transactions over 50 grand? She stared at me for a long moment before her expression shifted from confusion to realization. You mean the redundant ledger system? The one that logged to the offsite vault servers? I nodded, and she exhaled sharply. Far as I know, it's still active. Nobody ever disabled it. It was embedded in the legacy financial software. Zachary probably doesn't even know it exists. That changed the calculus. If the old backup system was still running, then everything, every forged invoice, every unauthorized contract, every dollar siphoned through a shell account that had already been automatically archived off-site, untouched, unaltered, and far beyond Gavin's or Zachary's reach. Nina, I said quietly, I'm going to ask you to do something that may put you in an uncomfortable position. But if you do it, the law protects you. I handed her a sealed envelopian internal ethics complaint with attached documentation, tailored to her role and referencing only data she had legitimate access to. Submitting it would force internal audit to open an official review. Once that happened, they could no longer ignore or quietly bury the irregularities without triggering a compliance breach. She hesitated. They've been talking about layoffs, she whispered. Whispers about consolidating the whole department. Do you think that's why? I think, I said evenly, that they're pushing out anyone who still remembers how real accounting is supposed to work. She took the envelope. The next 48 hours moved like a chess match, slow, silent, and heavy with anticipation. I met with my attorney one last time, updated my contingency files, and finalized the automated release systems. I received a text from Trent, the auditor, who had heard that Zachary was asking questions about legacy protocols and looked visibly unsettled during a budget meeting. The noose was tightening, but they didn't know it was their own rope they were tugging on. On the morning of the third day, the chain reaction began. Bethany, who had taken over part of Nina's duties, filed the internal complaint. Simultaneously, the board members I had reached out to received my evidence packets, each delivered electronically and tracked for confirmation. By noon, Elaine had invoked her authority as chair of the audit committee to call an emergency board session. Gavin was seen entering the building flanked by legal counsel, and Zachary, according to a message Trent forwarded to me, was escorted to a separate room for individual review. I wasn't in the room when it happened. I didn't need to be. The numbers were finally speaking for themselves. As evening fell, I walked along the quiet river path where Evelyn and I used to go after her treatments. The sky was painted in the muted orange of late summer, and the wind had just enough bite to remind me that change, once begun, cannot be undone. That night, I slept for the first time in weeks, not because it was over, but because the truth had finally found its way to the surface. 6 weeks after I walked out of Crestmore with a cardboard box in my arms, and 15 years of service reduced to silence, everything that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. But it didn't explode in the way Hollywood might write it. There were no shouting matches, no slamming doors, no climactic courtroom scenes. What happened was quieter, colder, and far more effective. It began with a simple calendar invite. Elaine Maddox had officially called an emergency board session under her authority as chair of the audit committee. The subject line read, Urgent Financial Oversight Review. That morning, the glass walls of Crestmore's top-floor conference room, once adorned with Gavin's motivational slogans about vision and velocity, became a theater of silence, tension, and consequence. While the board convened, Bethany sent me text updates from the accounting floor, where people were moving like whispers, glancing toward the elevators as security escorted Zachary to a closed-door session with legal. Moments later, Gavin was seen pacing near the break room. His confidence eroded, his shirt untucked for the first time since the day he arrived. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone felt it. The shift, the reckoning, the turning of a tide that had seemed immovable for months. I didn't go into the building. I had no desire to sit at that long table and listen to men who once dismissed me now pretend they hadn't. My place was not at the center of the fire, but just outside it, where I could feel the heat and know it was real. By late afternoon, the news had reached every department. Crestmore Industries was under full internal investigation. External auditors had arrived with briefcases, laptops, and subpoenas. All expense accounts from Gavin's tenure were frozen. Several executives, those hired under his leadership, were placed on administrative leave, and Zachary's access to the financial systems was revoked within the hour. That evening, I turned off my phone and took a slow walk along the river Evelyn and I used to visit in our younger years. Back when hope didn't need strategy and the idea of retirement was something we talked about like a vacation we hadn't earned yet, I watched the lights from the city reflect off the water's surface and felt, for the first time in a long while, the quiet weight of peace settling into my chest. The next morning, 3 voicemails waited on my Lineone from Chase Monroe, another from Gavin, and the last from a blocked number I recognized as belonging to the legal firm Cressmore kept on retainer. I didn't listen to any of them. Instead, I answered the one call that did matter. It was Anthony Rivas, the oldest board member, a man of few words, but, when spoken, rarely wasted. "Walter," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "I just wanted you to know 15 years of clean books, not a single restatement, not one missed audit. You were the firewall, and we failed to see that. I should have spoken up sooner." "You're speaking now," I told him. "That's what matters." He went quiet for a moment and then said, "The board has removed Gavin and Zachary for cause. Chase has resigned. We've asked Elaine to step in as interim CEO, and we'd like you to return at least temporarily to help oversee the forensic audit and stabilize the transition." I let the offer hang for a while as I watched a tugboat churn through the river fog, its engine humming steady like a heartbeat refusing to falter. The invitation meant something, but I'd already made my decision. "I'll help with the investigation," I replied, "but I won't be coming back permanently." There was a pause. "May I ask why?" "Because Cressmore needs someone who can innovate," I said, allowing a small smile to tug at the corner of my mouth. "And apparently, I'm just a little too old school." 3 months later, I stood on the back deck of a modest cabin tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. The air was sharp with pine, the sun slipping behind the horizon like a quiet exhale. I had finally made the move Evelyn and I once talked about during her chemo sessions back, when someday was all we had to hold on to. The investigation had concluded. Over $12 million in misallocated funds had been traced, recovered, and reported. Gavin, Zachary, and 2 members of the board faced federal charges for wire fraud and financial conspiracy. Cressmore, under Elaine's leadership, had committed to a full governance overhaul, and more importantly, no employee pensions or wages were impacted during the Faluda condition I insisted on before agreeing to lend my hand in the cleanup. I didn't give interviews, I didn't make statements. The story wasn't about me. But I did get one final text from Bethany. "Got promoted director of accounting. The new leadership wants to rebuild properly. They said your files saved the company." I smiled, typing back 3 simple words. "Well deserved. Always verify." As the evening deepened, I opened the old leather portfolio Evelyn had given me, the one I'd carried through cancer, betrayal, and redemption. Inside was a photo of the 2 of us at the lake houses unburned, happy, unaware of the battles that would come. "You were right," I said softly to the woman whose strength I still carried. "I should have made more time for views like this." Tomorrow, I'd meet with a small nonprofit down the road that needed help cleaning up their financial records. Nothing glamorous, just honest work. Some might call that outdated. I call it integrity. There's a strange kind of clarity that arrives after you've lived through betrayal, not the kind that stings and fades, but the kind that tries to erase you altogether. It doesn't come with vindication or applause, and it certainly doesn't feel like triumph. Instead, it feels like stillness, like sitting alone in a quiet house and realizing that, for the first time in a long time, there's nothing left you need to brace for. In the months that followed the Cressmore investigation, I was asked more than once if I felt satisfied with the outcome if justice had truly been served. And every time, I answered the same way. Justice isn't about evening the score. It's about restoring balance to something that was broken. What happened to Gavin and Zachary, what came of the fraud they thought would never be uncovered, wasn't my victory, it was a return to the truth. And truth, as I've come to understand, doesn't need revenge to stand tall. It just needs time, and someone patient enough to carry it until it can no longer be ignored. I spend my days differently now. I rise early, not because I have meetings or quarterly targets to chase, but because the mountain air reminds me that each morning is its own kind of beginning. I volunteer at a local nonprofit that helps veterans manage their benefits, using the same spreadsheets and logic I once brought into boardrooms, only now, no one's trying to outmaneuver the math. I sit with people who've been overlooked for years, not because they lack worth, but because the world moves too fast to remember who built its foundations. Sometimes, when I pass the mirror in the hallway, I barely recognize the man staring back. Not because I've aged, though I have, but because I'm no longer the version of myself that needed a title to feel useful. The man in the mirror carries lines drawn by cancer, grief, and betrayal, but also by endurance, clarity, and an unshakable belief that doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything, is never something to regret. And in the quiet of evening, when the sun spills over the ridgeline and paints the cabin in golden light, I take out the old portfolio Evelyn gave Metha, that held contracts, audits, and for a time, the burden of a fight I didn't ask for but knew I had to finish. Inside it now are letters from former co-workers, a printed article about Cressmore's recovery, and a handwritten note from Bethany that simply reads, "You were right to stay steady. We just didn't know how much we needed it." There's comfort in knowing that legacy isn't what you leave behind in titles or accolades, but in the choices you make when no one is watching. If you've made it this far, maybe you've walked through something similar. Maybe you were replaced before your time, labeled as obsolete because the world didn't understand the depth of your value. Maybe you too know what it's like to hold everything together while everything around you falls apart. If so, I want you to remember this. You are not alone, you are not forgotten, and you are not finished. Some might call people like us outdated, but I've learned that the old ways of truth, of loyalty, of integrity don't fade. They outlast. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to this channel for more powerful, true-to-life stories about resilience, justice, and the quiet strength of those who rise after being cast aside. You are the proof that time doesn't diminish value, only reveals it. Saw to you. Hit the bell so you never miss a comeback story that might just remind you of your own.